In this lecture, we want to talk about production grade MCP and see that how stateful MCP is relevant to that. If you have deployed any application to production, you know that your deployment must be able to scale out or be horizontally scalable to cope with the potential increase in the load or the number of requests that are received. And for that, we normally deploy more than one instance of our server or MCP server. Normally, you deploy your MCP server to an environment that can scale out. For example, in Amazon Web Services, you may use an auto-scaling group, or in Microsoft Azure, you may use a scaling set. Then you put a load balancer or HTTP load balancer in front of your MCP servers, and the client or MCP client will not directly access the MCP servers, it will talk to the HTTP load balancer. So the streamable HTTP is established between the client and the load balancer. And the load balancer directs the traffic to MCP servers, and in doing so, HTTP load balancer has to pass all the HTTP headers to MCP servers, because as you already know, the session ID and authentication token and the accept header, they are all within that streamable HTTP request, and therefore they should be passed on to MCP servers so the MCP servers can see the session ID and all the other information that are received from the MCP client. In a production grade deployment, you are not using HTTP, you will use HTTPS. It is a very good practice and is highly recommended that you obtain a SSL certificate from a certificate authority, for example, from Let's Encrypt or GoDaddy, and terminate it or install it on your HTTP load balancer. So that enables HTTPS between MCP client and load balancer, and then you allow normal HTTP traffic between your load balancer and MCP servers. And by doing so, you will not have to implement HTTP support within your MCP server. It makes your deployment a lot easier. Now the challenge is that because you have more than one MCP server, and by default, every MCP server maintains the session information, for example, the session ID, in its memory. If the first request from MCP client goes to the first instance of MCP server, the session ID will be in its memory. And then the second request from the client, if it goes to the second MCP server, there is no session ID in there. And therefore, basically, we are not maintaining a stateful connection between client and servers. To fix this problem, you need a database of any sort that you prefer. Normally, Redis is a good option because Redis is basically a key value type of database and allows very fast access to data. And all the instances of your MCP server will have to have access to Redis and store the session information in Redis as key value pair. In this key value pair data, the key is always session ID that you can obtain. So in MCP server, there is an object called context. I will show you in Visual Studio soon. If you just inject context into your MCP's code, you can access session ID, and then you can store any information that you want to have in cache in Redis using that session ID as the key. Back to Visual Studio, under MCP folder and streamable HTTP directory, I have cloned this server and called it server with Redis. By default, as I said, if you start a server as streamable HTTP, it is a stateful MCP server. So statefulness is part of being MCP, and therefore it's enabled by default. However, if for any reason you don't want your MCP server to be stateful, you can disable it. To do that, when you create an instance of FastMCP, pass this parameter, stateless HTTP, true. By doing so, your MCP server is not going to maintain any sessions. Why this is good? If you don't really need session information and you only want to access your MCP server over HTTP, you can disable the statefulness and use less resources and make your MCP a little bit faster. So I just copy this and use it without stateless HTTP. Now, within my MCP server, if I want to access session information, I need a context. So first import the context from mcp.server fastmcp library, and then inject it into your MCP server. So it will be like ctx context. Now, within the code of your MCP server, you can read session ID like this. You can say session ID is context or ctx.session_ID. And then you can use session ID to store any information that you want in a database. For example, Redis, PostgreSQL, MySQL, or anything that you wish. Let's assume that we have deployed a Redis somewhere. To access it, you can import Redis. And after obtaining session ID, you can say Redis client is Redis, and then pass the host and port and database and all that. If you have username and password, you can also pass username and password to your Redis. Obviously, in a production environment, your username and password must be read from a secret manager. And then you can use Redis client, set, and then put the session ID as the key and any data you wish. For example, response from LLM or record from database or anything like that. For now, just put name, this parameter in here. You can store anything you want with set and use session ID as key in Redis. Obviously, if you want to see if this name is stored in Redis, you need to do a, for example, say stored name is Redis get, and then pass the session ID as the key. If this stored name is not in Redis, it will be none. So you can say if stored name is none, then store, say, name using session ID in the client. Otherwise, use this stored name for whatever reason that you want. For example, say pass it to this function. So that is how you manage the session across multiple instances of your MCP server. Now that we are here and we have access to context, we can also use context for other things. For example, for debugging your code, you can use CTX to generate logs. Let's say you want to generate a log as information. You just say CTX info, and then you can say, for example, returning results, something like this. Or if you are doing any sort of calculation, you can create a try except block. It doesn't matter what this code does. It's Copilot generating this random code. And in here, if you say you want to, for example, log error, you can say CTX error and then pass error code or error message here. You can use it for that as well. There is also a capability called sampling. I will explain it later. First, we need to learn about MCP clients. We will learn that in the future lecture.